King of the Harem Heaven, Chapter 6. Once again, the day in Washtenaw County Circuit Court opened with a flying roller girl in the witness chair. This time it was young Emma Butler, called by the defense. "How long have you lived in the house at 37 Hamlin Avenue?" Colonel John Atkinson asked her. "For several months now." "Have you ever seen or heard anything in the slightest way improper in the conduct of the defendant Michael Mills?" "No," the girl swore. "Nothing." "There has been testimony of an alleged meeting taking place just prior to the defendant's arrest. A meeting at which he supposedly ordered the girls to give false stories to the police. Will you tell us about this?" "There wasn't any such meeting. There wasn't ever anything like that." In cross-examination, Assistant Prosecutor Springer was unable to shake the girl's testimony. Colonel Atkinson next called two character witnesses named Joseph Dickinson and Hobart Gray. Both testified that they'd known Mills for many years. They described him as honest, sober, moral, and religious, stating they never heard a single indecent expression from his lips. The best young Oscar Springer could do in cross-examination was to bring out the admission that they hadn't seen Mike Mills at all since he'd become an Israelite. Three more character witnesses followed: Joseph Daly, Edward Durand, and Samuel Thaler, all long-haired, bearded flying rollers. Each swore fervently that Prince Michael was a saint. The state's attorney was able to make no dent in their testimony, but he was able to make their blind fanaticism clear to the jury. The last defense witness was a man named Flavius Brooke. Under the colonel's skillful guidance, he described a number of the citizens' meeting that had been held and read aloud a number of articles from the Detroit papers. Articles with headings like a bestial religion, a human devil, or a long-haired prince of darkness. He mentioned that money had been collected for the girls on a number of occasions. In cross-examination, Oscar Springer managed to establish that the total amount of money collected for the girls was mere pin money. That Bernice Bickle, for example, had received only $2.06 for a few necessities while living at the police station, and that these donations had come from reputable established churches. "Your Honor," Colonel Atkinson rose to address Judge Kinney after Flavius Brooke was dismissed from the chair. "I wish to express my sincere regret that the defendant's religion forbids him to testify in his own behalf. The defense now rests." Groans of disappointment and then catcalls came from the crowded courtroom. The audience had been looking forward to watching Prince Mike undergo questioning. The judge dutifully quieted the outburst.
"Silence in the court!"
And Assistant Prosecutor Springer then stepped forward to sum up for the state of Michigan. "The counsel for the defendant made many allegations as to what he would prove here," the young state's attorney began. "Among other things, finding fault with the police and charging them with perjury and suborning perjury. He insisted over and over again that he would prove the existence of a vast conspiracy against the defendant, a conspiracy in which the police, the press, the merchants and real estate brokers, the citizens and the churches of the north side of Detroit were all involved. I ask you now, has he proved anything of the kind?" Oscar Springer went on to attack the claims of the defense in a sound but somewhat routine manner. The jury and the audience listened attentively, but they wanted more fireworks. Disappointment hung in the air. Then, very abruptly, the assistant prosecutor was waving a sheet of paper. The counsel for the defendant also insinuated that young Bernice Bickle was not a virgin at the time this crime was committed. He accused her of having connection with other men and threatened her with a mysterious confession she'd made, taking advantage of the fact that she'd broken down under the ordeal of testifying here, to plant doubts about her chastity in your minds. Upon being pressed to produce this alleged confession as evidence, he ducked out on a convenient legal technicality. "Well, I have this so-called confession that Eliza Court, who sits there at the side of the defendant, forced this child to write. This incriminating document the defense was afraid to produce, and when I read it to you, you'll see." "Objection!" Colonel Atkinson shouted with all the strength in his lungs. "Your Honor, that document was obtained by an illegal search and cannot be admitted in evidence. Furthermore, it is a confidence protected by law. The names of the innocent are involved here, including the name of innocent little Bernice Bickle," Oscar Springer shouted back at him. Gentlemen, Judge Kinney slammed down his gavel again and again as the angry words of the lawyers rose above the roar of the crowd. "Approach the bench." While the attorneys argued the point in a huddle with the judge and the courtroom hummed with anticipation, Michael Mills and Eliza Court whispered together, and the fear on their faces was clear for all to read. Behind them, in their row of supporters, Benjamin Franklin Purnell sat with his features frozen in haughty righteousness. But, once again, when Judge Kinney finally ruled that the state's attorney could read the confession, the strange eyes framed by the long red gold hair and beard were practically laughing out loud. He'd finally found the right paper, hidden away in a remote corner of God House. Once he'd read it, the reason the defense was keeping it out of evidence was obvious. Before the proceedings began that morning, he'd slipped it to a prosecution aide. "I confess before the God of the living," the assistant prosecutor now read, "that I have sinned in thought and word and deed. 6 or 7 years ago I did bad things with a boy named Elias Jones and my brother Frank because they threatened me that the boogeyman would catch me. I stole money from my mother's purse and 5 cents from my father's pocket. When my mother scolded me, I made faces and called her names behind her back. I cut my hair in the front and then denied it up and down. I teased my cousin until she got angry and then talked about her behind her back. I talked about Mrs. Redfern and called her a bitch and Lottie a little slut. I said I didn't like Sister Eliza Court because she is too cross-looking. I said I would not be an Israelite because they look silly with their hair hanging down. About a week before I came here, I was asked what church my parents belonged to. Because there was so much bad talk about the Israelites, I said Methodist. This is all I know about, and I'm sorry and pray that God will forgive me. Bernice Bickle." The courtroom audience sat in shocked silence, then broke out muttering. Angry stares burned down on Mike Mills and his spiritual affinity and his attorney from every direction. Oscar Springer waited just long enough to let the words sink in, then went on explosively. "These, gentlemen of the jury, are the sins little Bernice has committed. This is the confession Colonel Atkinson has talked about and made such a great point of in attempting to convince you she was not a virgin when she fell into the defendant's clutches. She was 7 or 8 years old. The typical sex play of a little girl with her brother and a little neighbor boy. The games of children, playing doctor most likely. This is what the colonel calls having connection with a male person, blistering his lips with shame and trying to drag her down in infamy." He paused and pointed at the long-haired prince. "To protect a man like this in his villainy. To shield a man like this in his crimes." He shook his head slowly. "Gentlemen of the jury, think of the awful things little Bernice told us. Nothing could prevail upon him to stop. She prayed, she cried, she pleaded, she protested, and in all of the eminent speeches of the great Colonel Atkinson, including the one he is certain to make when I finish, nowhere will you find as much eloquence as in that simple answer she gave here. I told him not to. I told him to stop. She could say no more. She was powerless, a lamb in the hands of the wolf, at his mercy in his den of infamy, wickedness, and disgrace. If there is a man on this jury who has a daughter, who has watched her as she came from the cradle and began to toddle, and then to walk, and then to run and meet him when he came home at night. If there is a man on this jury who loves his little girl as I love mine, he cannot help but feel about this case as I feel about it. My daughter is dearer to me than the blood that flows through my heart this second. And if anybody should be guilty of committing a crime like this upon her, the Lord have mercy upon him. I wouldn't. Gentlemen of the jury, do your duty and do it quickly. Send little Bernice Bickle forth as a pure girl and a lady, not a harlot and a prostitute. Let that child go out of this court, not branded forever, but with a verdict that will give her justice. Simply that and nothing more. And then go home to your families. I thank you." The courtroom applauded and cheered wildly, while the gavel of Judge Kinney slammed down again and again. Just as the young assistant prosecutor had predicted, Colonel Atkinson rose to the occasion with superb skill and eloquence. He repeated his claim that a gigantic conspiracy against the defendant had been plotted, that the witnesses had been bribed, that the police had taken part in the plot and had taken indecent liberties with the girls while holding them at the Woodbridge station. He cited the admissions he'd won from the 2 detectives and the testimony of Flavius Brooke about the citizens' meetings and the raising of funds. Finally, he launched into a brilliant passage comparing Prince Michael to Christ and the Bickle girl to Barabbas. "The mob is screaming, 'Crucify him and give us Barabbas!' The newspapers, the curious and unthinking who crowd this courtroom, The human refuse on the lawn outside. All are demanding that you clear the name of an appealing little thief who has been bribed to commit perjury by nailing up on the cross a just man who's been guilty of nothing more than practicing the religion he preaches. But it was no use. Puncturing the doubts about Bernice Bickle's chastity, the introduction of the childishly innocent confession had already decided the case. There was no applause for the colonel's eloquence when he finally ended his arguments. Judge Edward Kinney then charged a jury. He mentioned that the Bickle girl's virginity, or lack of it, was a crucial point of the offense with which the defendant was charged. But he also mentioned that the childish sex play of a 7 or 8-year-old girl was not to be considered in determining her chastity. Seldom are courts of justice called upon to investigate human affairs so painful and distressing, if true, he announced. If such a crime has been committed, as the people assert, public justice demands a prompt and complete vindication. The jury gave him just that, remaining out only 5 minutes before bringing back a verdict of guilty. The courtroom audience broke out in the loudest and longest burst of cheering yet. The judge made no move to quiet the demonstration, but merely waited patiently until it wore itself out, then gave Prince Michael K. Mills the maximum sentence: 5 years at hard labor in Jackson State Prison. "Take me too!" Eliza Court shrieked as a deputy sheriff led the deposed prince away. "Take me with him! Let me bear his cross! Let me share his torment!" The deputies dragged her back, kicking and scratching. Benjamin Franklin Purnell had been privileged to witness the vengeance that awaited false prophets, the swift and inexorable wrath of the state of Michigan. The lesson should have been clear and obvious, but Ben Purnell hadn't learned it. His only thought, as he left that Ann Arbor courtroom, was that the path to power was open now, that the throne was empty and waiting.